If you've had students in your classes who are clearly withdrawn, struggling, and you aren't sure how best to help them, or even if it's your role to help them as a teacher or to what extent you should be helping them, then today's episode is going to be so helpful for you. We're joined by Dr. Farhana Mann, who is a specialist working at UCL with young people and adults, in particular looking at loneliness, social isolation, and common mental health conditions. We're going to be diving into the common mental health conditions that we see in young people, how that links with neurodiversity and social isolation, and what we could be doing as teachers to support those students. So let's jump in. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today, Farhana, and I'll hand over to you for people who might not know who you are yet, so they can find out a little bit more about your specialism.
Thank you, Katie. So yes, I am Farhana Mann. I am a consultant psychiatrist background, so I'm a medical doctor specialising in mental health, and I work with adults, and many of the adults I work with are young adults who have neurodivergence, or they may have ADHD or be on the autism spectrum, but I see people with a full range of mental health problems. I also have spent many years researching loneliness and social isolation and connection in the context of mental health and mental illness at UCL. And most recently, I've started a YouTube channel that is brand new that's trying to promote healthy sort of social skills and mental health habits in very young children.
Love it. And that's actually how we found each other and met, because we've been on a YouTube course for anyone that is creating content to help young people, basically. So yeah, I'll put all of that linked to the bottom. We can talk about that a bit more at the end as well. So what's been your experience so far then? I know you mainly work with adults. So my viewers, mainly we are thinking about 13 up to 18-year-olds. Some people might have a few older people, but probably not. People don't tend to reset anymore. But in terms of mental health that you've seen, what have been some of the biggest challenges in the more recent years that you've seen presenting in young adults?
So I think, there's always a background level of certain mental health problems that present all the time. There were some big shifts that we're still getting to understand post-pandemic, I think, in particularly for a lot of young people that were impacted by being out of school, with GCSEs. It disrupted huge changes to their lives and adolescence that we're seeing a rise in sort of common mental disorder, what we call common mental disorder. So things like depression, anxiety, for example, in young people. So there has been that increase. I thought it was always there. And the other thing I think we are seeing more of, and I think I want to stress very much so that it's not a problem of overdiagnosis, but rather that more self-awareness around neurodiversity or people, say, with ADHD or neurodivergence rather, or being on the autism spectrum and coming to see me as an adult. Often that's as a young adult. Perhaps they've gone to university, the scaffolding around school and the protective systems or familiarity of home even is not there. And then a lot of stuff comes to the surface and it may manifest as depression or other problems. So I am seeing a lot of young people with that. And I think it's really positive that they are more aware about getting this sort of help early on, even if it's later than perhaps it could have been in place. It's still a great start to develop that self-awareness and think about how they can get through life a bit more easily.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point as well, because it's obviously debated a lot of things about mental health and neurodivergency. It's like, people are just self-diagnosing now because everyone's got something nowadays. It's a big thing people are saying. And I guess I don't know whether you will know like a factual answer of this or whether it's just your own opinion. First of all, are there more people who are being diagnosed with what you said, the common mental health conditions and neurodivergence? And do you think that is just, like you said, more awareness, better diagnosis? Or as some people are saying, is it just people are coming saying, I think I have this, and they are being diagnosed, maybe not correctly, self-diagnosing?
Yeah, so very important question. And I think in terms of, I don't want to quote any numbers off the top of my head, but certainly there is evidence out there. I'm sure I can try and find the actual numbers of the podcast if you want to see that, yes, diagnosis of certain conditions has gone up, but that is linked with people coming forwards and exploring whether they may have these difficulties. Also, as we said, post-pandemic in young people, there genuinely was this cohort of a significant life stressor that may have triggered symptoms coming to the surface that we then see. So that's a genuine presence of something. And in terms of ADHD or autism spectrum, hugely the case that we just didn't have a clue. Even in my time, going back, say, 20 years ago when we were first learning about what is autism, it was a very dichotomous kind of black or white. ADHD looks like this. It exist with autism. They're kind of two separate things. You have autism or you have ADHD, and autism was much more about people having language delay and a very kind of limited view of what it was to be on. This notion of the autism spectrum was also quite new. So our own knowledge has increased vastly, and I think we're better at understanding what it is to be someone who may on the surface be functioning relatively well in certain areas, but they've been masking. And the other thing I would say is people may be self-identifying, they may be going online, looking at TikTok. There's a lot of misinformation out there. So there's certainly evidence that people may be identifying with things that aren't quite at the level of meeting a diagnostic threshold, but it might help them learn about themselves. But the fact that you go and see, ideally, for example, a consultant psychiatrist, or it might be a GP if it's a common mental health disorder, or perhaps a psychologist for other issues, is that when you meet the professional, that process of diagnosing, of assessing, is actually a very thorough, serious process. So the diagnosing itself isn't something one would take lightly. Prescribing medication, or even if we diagnose and don't prescribe, is something we have to be accountable for and take very seriously. So certainly in my practice, if I don't feel the person meets a diagnostic threshold, they won't get a diagnosis. So even if they're coming forwards, and that doesn't mean they don't deserve help, but it may be that diagnostic doesn't help you in the way that you might have thought, but here are things that maybe you do need support with. So as doctors, there's been a sort of drop in how thorough we are in terms of assessing people. I think there is a genuine need, and ideally people should have thorough, proper assessments. That's probably very important for people to keep in mind.
So with the common mental health conditions, so you said it was depression and was it anxiety, the other one?
Yeah, so mainly depression and anxiety. They are kind of umbrella terms. Anxiety includes things like OCD, PTSD. So the sort of anxiety spectrum, so not spectrum, other anxiety disorders, not a spectrum, includes a number of different conditions if you explore more deeply. So I'm speaking about broadly anxiety disorders.
Yeah. And so from my experience within schools, I definitely did see an increase in the number of students who were diagnosed with different mental health conditions. And I think it is, like you said, there's better diagnosis. I think maybe partly as well, it's more acceptance and less taboo around it. So people aren't hiding the fact that they are struggling and need help, and they're not embarrassed to say, oh, I've got depression. So I was having more and more students who did need help. And one thing that I always struggled with was not really knowing how I could help them on a day-to-day basis. And I know there's debate around, well, for a teacher, what extent is actually your job? But as a human, like who has empathy, you're like, well, I want to help you. I know you're struggling. So I know you're not like a teacher specialist, but what sorts of things do you think, like just from a day-to-day perspective, might be supportive and to help students that might be struggling?
Yeah, so important. I mean, I know there's evidence from various surveys, again, I can't remember exactly which the sources were, but surveying thousands of young people where teachers consistently come up as one of the top sort of confidants. Who would you go to? Quite often, depending on the topic, it's your teacher, certainly in that teenage, that sort of early adolescence period, relative to parents. And that doesn't mean that these are children who have terrible home environments or, emotionally neglectful parents, but it's just naturally a place where perhaps with certain sensitive topics or things that are happening at school, they may feel more comfortable talking to a teacher. So I think it's a hugely important influence and such a powerful presence. And I've got 3 kids of my own. It matters hugely, their relationships with their teachers in terms of how they get through the school day. So I think there are things that can be done. I think the power of kind of they call them micro, small things that can be done that accumulate over time is not to be kind of, understated at all. I think lots of regular interaction and getting to build that relationship over time is very powerful. And you have that opportunity to be with the same people consistently over time, sometimes over years, interacting with the same people. So for example, if somebody seems withdrawn or you notice differences in how they're interacting or something's changed, I guess giving privacy, first of all, so that we know the adolescent brain feels shame and being watched much more powerfully, like physiologically more powerfully than at other stages of life, younger and older. So that ability to give them a private space if you're going to have a chat or ask them about something, and then gently inquiring whether they're okay, if there's something going on, and just a simple entry into the conversation could be all that's needed before you can then reflect on, am I the right person to help? Because you can't be their therapist or their doctor or whatever, but you could be the first safe adult that they share something with. But also I think with neurodivergence, there are things that schools, I think now, even looking back 10 years, are generally much better at, and just even knowing the concept, we as doctors are better at it, and schools are also getting better at it, of recognizing that not all, one size doesn't fit all. And so our expectations of behavior, obviously there are certain red lines compliance and safety, etc. But beyond that, earlier than that, there's a sort of sense that actually we don't all learn the same way, and that's fine. And as adults, we don't all learn the same way. We go off and excel in particular things, and maybe it's a lot easier. Then we find our tribes. We don't have to be popular and have a bunch of friends, but you do ideally find one or two places where you feel comfortable, or normalizing, I guess, the fact that you might need certain adjustments. So whether it's learning a bit more quietly, you're not the person who steps forward and takes charge, but you are still learning, and accepting that I'm going to push this person and check in with them. But when we're all exposed and in front of our friends, I will kind of naturally allow an adjustment that's quite reasonable, that allows them to participate in their own way and grow. And I think that's hugely powerful. So things like that. And predictability would be the other thing for kids who are neurodivergent.
Yeah, absolutely. And linking into that neurodivergency, so I know you've got some experience with young adults who are also neurodivergent. Is there a link then between those two that you see?
In terms of
like mental health and neurodivergency, Yeah,
so there is. And because you could go through life and recognise that you maybe have ADHD or you're on, I think I'm on the autism spectrum, but you've found a tribe, you've found a setup in life that works. The environment around you actually suits that quite well. You may then never want to diagnosis necessarily. You might think this is actually fine, that I understand this about myself. I've got this self-awareness. That's how I interact with the world. This is how I avoid being overwhelmed or feel burnout. I've got these connections. I've got 2 or 3, and they are powerful and they mean a lot to me. And only if you developed additional sort of mental health problems might you then see a psychiatrist or a GP, for example. So it could be that you don't have any mental health problems, but statistically, so looking on average across the population, you are more at risk, definitely, if you have autism or ADHD, of other problems like potentially depression, anxiety, or even other more severe mental health problems, potentially psychosis, much rarer overall, but you are at heightened risk of those things. Some of that could be to do with sort of loneliness and self-esteem. And if you think about children with ADHD, who the amount of sort of negative comments and information they get about themselves, they then tend to attack themselves with as well. So it's kind of a real assault on one's self-esteem, whether it's intended to be or not. It may be shared with the best intention, like I'm just trying to do the best for you, But actually, if that accumulates over time, the cumulative impact can be that it really does take a big hit on that person's sense of who they are relative to others in the world and where they belong. So if you can have, I think a big thing that school can do is build a sense of belonging, a sense of your sort of identity and connection early on, could be so powerful for protecting against sort of developing mental health problems later on. So yes, statistically, there is a higher risk if you have ADHD or on the autism spectrum, but not necessarily. And the environment can really be important in shaping what comes up.
And actually kind of started to answer my next question. I don't know if there is an answer currently, but is it something about the differences in how your brain works that then also means that difference in your brain makes you more likely to, or statistically there's a higher association between you having mental health? Or is it because you have this neurodivergency, your life experience is different and it's an environmental things that are triggering this mental health condition? But again, I don't know if there's a way to work that out or if there's anything known about that. But from what you were saying then just said, it sounds like potentially it's more environmental. It's what you're dealing with and masking.
Yeah, I mean, it's this. So it's both. And you're right that we don't know precisely, as with many aspects of the brain, we don't fully understand how all the mechanisms around how things lead to something else, or things like causality, for example, or versus sort of just correlation. So these are all things we are trying to learn over time. And so some of it is limited by what we can measure. And typically we don't tend to scan the brains of people who, if I see somebody we're considering ADHD or autism, they won't normally have a brain scan. It doesn't really influence the treatment per se, so it isn't really something we would do. There are certainly studies to show, I mean, you probably also know in terms of biology, that there are differences, so structural differences, and also in terms of neurotransmitter and function, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, in people with ADHD and the autism spectrum. And of course, I keep saying spectrum because it doesn't look the same in any two people. So depending on which bits, more challenging, whether it's emotional dysregulation or it's more sensory sensitivities, it may be different parts of the brain that might be involved. So certainly it's theoretically possible that there are biological differences that lead to being more at risk of certain mental health problems. We don't fully understand exactly what mechanisms are in play, but that seems likely that there are some differences. There's not enough for us to sort of predict you need to have this medication at this point, it will protect against this. So there is also evidence, so it's definitely most likely both, that environmental impact, environmental environmental adjustments, etc., have a huge impact in terms of the trajectory if you're on the autism spectrum, for example, as a teenager. And that doesn't just mean reasonable adjustments in a classroom, but also, the messages you get from home about yourself as a person. We know the environment any adolescent lives in is going to impact their mental health. And so it's also the case if you're neurodivergent, but even more so because so much of the challenge is this mismatch between your interaction with the world and what the society's average expectation of is of what normal sort of typical social interaction is. So it really is, I think increasingly we're trying to see it as less of a kind of this fundamental deficit or problem with you that we must fix, but rather this mismatch. And so what can we do to create more inclusive societies that include the full range of people, some of whom have exceptional ability, and we really ought to be, not just people with exceptional ability, but it's a loss to us to not include everybody. So I think those adjustments, but also thinking about the world in general, sensory sensitivities, etc., how we set up our environments so that everyone blends and is able to function and get what they need out of it is helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And from a classroom point of view, this was actually quite a big thing that I focused on with Dr. Sam and Dr. Christine when we did the whole episode on the autism spectrum, and just being aware of like the sensory stimulations in your surroundings. So it is an environment that all your students can be comfortable and able to learn in is so key. And now I know another big area that you focus on is loneliness and social isolation. Now, when I hear that, I instinctively think of elderly people because, I don't know, maybe that's just what I'm told by the media, but in my head, that's something that mainly affects the elderly. But do you see that in young people quite a lot as well, or is it mainly in elderly people?
It's very sensible that you kind of bring this up because we, as a scientific community, looking at loneliness, also mostly had evidence coming from older people. So it was the default, it's the kind of natural thinking process is that this is clearly a transition in life where there may be grief or loss literally through death or through family moving away, through changing identity because you've retired, you're no longer in the workforce, maybe places are not as accessible because of physical health. So there's a natural sort of, that's most likely a time when you will get lonely. And it is. And so when we did some meta-analyses or systematic reviews of all of the evidence before we started figuring out which areas we wanted to research in loneliness at UCL, most of the published evidence was in people over 65 or over, and typically in sort of what we might call kind of Western country cultural settings. So there's also that to think about when we get our evidence. But since that time, again, it's kind of the last 10, 15 years or so, and I think more so even since the pandemic, although we were looking at this years before, that there's more awareness, that there's more of a kind of U-shaped distribution, so that in fact, as relevant to your audience, there is a particular peak in adolescence, and a number of surveys have highlighted 13 to 17 as a time in life when people might strongly identify as feeling lonely, but it's not obviously considered. And it's hugely important because what you then do about it is going to look very different if you're an 85-year-old retired person who may have physical disabilities or not, versus a 13-year-old who maybe is on the autism spectrum or isn't and is not finding any meaningful social connection around them and becomes increasingly lonely or isolated. And so that's certainly highlighted that group in particular struggle with feelings of loneliness. And it seems to be men and girls and boys, males and females, no clear difference in terms of gender as far as we can see.
And have you, from that research, got any indicators of what might be the different causes then for teenagers to be feeling just as lonely and isolated as elderly people? Because like you said, there's some clear reasons why we would know you'd feel isolated as you get older. But what about for young people then, where we think we're surrounded by people every day in school? So what is it that is then making them feel so isolated and lonely?
Yeah. So again, something we're still learning about, but certainly mental health comes into it. So sometimes it can be that a person is struggling with some aspect of mental health. Bullying and that aspect did come up. So feeling left out, physically out of the social groups that you're in, that you would naturally maybe fall into at school. So bullying seems to be a theme that comes up that people will reflect on, either look back and say that was the thing that made me feel lonely, or when you ask in time, kind of cross-sectionally, they will say this is the thing they're struggling with. And so those are two things that did come out in terms of school environment. But certainly things like, if we know that young people who are on the autism spectrum, just because we're thinking a little about neurodivergence today, also have a much higher likelihood of identifying as lonely. And what people sometimes might find is they might think, well, someone on the autism spectrum, maybe they're not as interested or they're not socially motivated. Perhaps they don't want to be, socially connected. So it might look as though actually doesn't this suit you quite well. And that may be partly true in the sense that they might not want to connect in the same way, but it's often the case that they they will want a sense of meaningful, strong connection, but they're not finding something that suits them. So that's, I think, another key thing, is that if it is being driven by differences in how we communicate, then it can be really powerful for someone to have just having one teacher or one adult that they can confide in potentially or feel comfortable talking to, but also one or two friendships that may be more intense, maybe more meaningful, but really are very rewarding. And one thing I thought I'd highlight actually is when we define loneliness is it's different to, so it's not something one can really objectively say someone is experiencing or not. So it's very difficult for me to say, well, he is lonely just by looking at him, because like we said, he might find that that is actually the right level of social connection for him. And he has a few friends, I'm just not seeing them right now. And that is what matters to him. So it isn't a sort of quantity related, partly influenced by quantity, but it's much more about the meaningful aspect of that connection, the quality of that connection.
And I wonder how much, I imagine some people might be listening thinking, how much of this for young people might be due to social media, or has this always existed and maybe we just weren't collecting data on it then? Because if it is potentially due to bullying or feeling left out, things like WhatsApp groups or group chats. I mean, I probably sound ancient now. I know young people don't actually use WhatsApp, and now apparently if you use WhatsApp, you're so old. And I found that out recently. So let's say Snapchat, because apparently that's where they all chat now. But so I wonder how much of that is because it's now not you can just be left out at school during like 9 till 3. You can be left out 24 hours a day, and it can be made really clear to you, you're not in this group. So there's that adding to it. Do you know if there's like any research into that, or if that's something that's been considered as well?
Yeah, I think we are still in the early days. Unfortunately, with all these cohorts, it takes time to kind of influence this, after this, and that, but you've got social media and it keeps changing. But we are learning. And I think one important thing is that it's not all good, all bad. So there are many, it's a kind of a mixed exposure. So it can be potentially a very harmful thing for exactly the reasons you described, this sense of everything following you home 24 hours and there is no real separation. It's impossible to separate. I mean, if you turn your phone off, it's continuing. And if you are someone who's already feeling left out or perhaps you're particularly sensitive to rejection for whatever reason, you will ruminate probably even more on what might be happening if you're not online. So then you're compelled to sort of check just to make sure that things haven't changed, and then it might tell you something you don't really know. So it can be very, very, the potential is there, obviously, as we know, for it being very negative influence, but there's also the potential for it being a very positive influence. So there's this sense of trying to understand how it's being used. I think that's where teachers, schools can be so helpful, so powerful in their role in engaging that kind of, not banning, but critically engaging. Like, this is something that's in our lives. How do we interact with it? How do we make this something that's part of your life that's a positive thing on the whole? Thinking about critical engagement, co-regulation, like how does the stuff we see influence our nervous system? How are things designed? Even literally, I remember reading, I don't think there's any clear, established scientific evidence for this, but the fact that you flick through shorts so quickly, so that task shifting in your brain, to change from, I was doing this, now I'm doing that, now I'm doing this, now I'm doing that, is quite unnatural. We don't typically do that. And I was imagining in my childhood, there wasn't really that many things where I would quite so rapidly for a consistent period of time flick, task shift. And so it's kind of unnatural for our brains to do that. So you can sort of think how if you already have some struggles in that realm, it can make it even harder because you're having to sort of keep changing task and then sit down and read for ages. And it's sort of hang on, I'm just shifting task at a very rapid rate is very difficult to do. So, and the other thing is, I guess, the positive interactions. I have young people who I see who are, they're all adults now, so some of them are students at university, but who find online communities can be very helpful. They can reach out and find their tribe more easily than if they are restricted to, I guess, the kids that happen to be in their class, where on average it's less likely they'll meet people who may be the same as them. So that can be very powerful, just seeing how they get to that. But then again, those safe adults become very important, because when things might get a bit wobbly or something's happening online that isn't right, where would you go? And who would you talk to? And I think sometimes as people get older, that's the best we can offer. But certainly there's potential that it can be positive, and it can allow you to find your tribe and to follow your interests and passions. And I think when there's less social comparison becoming a big part of it, then it's much safer. There is evidence that people who use it passively, and this is old evidence, so again, it might not be Snapchat relevant, but certainly from the evidence that if you use it passively and you tend to compare yourself negatively, then it tends to be a vicious cycle and that makes you feel worse. On the other hand, even just the action of getting people to actively engage or put a positive comment incentive if they saw something someone was doing well, shifted the narrative to sort of, well, I'm part of your network, you're doing great, that's great, and I'm fine with it, good for you. And that just slightly shifted the state the brain was in. So I think a lot of it is about how you engage and trying to educate young people and ourselves to navigate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So your YouTube channel then, I know it's aimed at much younger people, but tell us a little bit about that then.
Yeah, so it's all very early days. So thanks for bringing it up. So I used to, before I did medicine, I used to present children's television and radio and write songs and sing and things like that. So it's very difficult to do that in a clinic, depending on the person who comes in. So I have to find a different outlet. And really this was just partly through, I think, having my own kids who are now 13, 11 and 6, but obviously were younger before. I found that a lot of the things that I would do with them to manage maybe challenges with emotional regulation or things that would be within the normal distribution of what a parent would need to navigate with kids, using kind of funny voices or songs or making it entertaining, and the tone of how I approached it just often made it more fun for me and an outlet for my singing, but also made it less of a chore and less of a sort of telling off. And so I think if someone was particularly sensitive that day, using stories or making it a bit funny and making it about someone else, and there's, for example, a puppet that I made out of a sock on the channel, just shifting the focus from you onto someone else maybe getting it wrong and how can we help them. Just being creative, I think, can be a really helpful way to build skills that might be really helpful later in life. So, or even at a young age in the playground. So conflict, social skills. It's kind of aimed not at anyone necessarily with a particular diagnosis or issue. It's kind of kids 3 to 10, and it's called Dr. Farhana Feelings and Fun, primary school-ish age. And it's just trying to build those skills and test out what we might think in terms of conflict and emotion and identifying feelings. And I think it helps everybody. If you happen to have ADHD or you're on the autism spectrum, it could be quite particularly helpful, some of the stuff. On the other hand, if you don't, I think everybody's brain is developing at that point. So it can be very useful for everyone. So that's kind of the goal. And I'd love people to, I guess, once I get an email address up there, connect and share what they want and what they find helpful. So that's
Oh, brilliant. And I need to check out in more detail, because I think because I've got twin 5-year-olds, and the two big things I'd say, one of them struggles with emotional regulation in the sense that he will get very frustrated and angry, and he needs to learn how to then bring that down so he can then actually think and reason. The other one can get very shy and hates it if he thinks people are looking at him, and he's already got what I would have thought was a teenage emotion of, oh my gosh, I don't want anyone to know I've had my hair cut because they're all going to look at me and comment on it, and like that side of things. I'm trying to those are the two things. So I'll have a look if there's something on there that'll help them with either of those sets of emotions on haircuts or just anything in general. But that's been reflected in their roles in the nativity. One is the narrator, the one that hates being the centre of attention. He's a cow in the background. So
they're exactly where they want to be.
Exactly.
Perfect.
But anyway, thank you so much for coming on. That's really, really interesting. And what I love about it is how scientific it is. Obviously, from a biology point of view, I'm it's really interesting to hear some of the science behind it as well as what we just see and perceive as teachers, to hear what is actually being researched and investigated. And so if people did want to find out more, is the best thing then to head to your YouTube channel, did you say, if they want to find out more from you?
Yeah, or I can, there are also papers, publications, maybe I can send you some links and things to connect with that will then, they can welcome to get in touch through UCL and love to chat.
Amazing. Well, I'll put that in the description below for anyone that is interested. But thank you for coming on, and thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
So hopefully you found that just as helpful as I did, and I'll be linking in the description some scientific papers that you may be interested in finding out more, plus how you can talk to Dr. Farhana Mann if you want any more requests for her YouTube channel or any more information.